And Labrador. The webinar is hosted by Dr. Moazzami, who's a professor of economics at Lakehead University. So my name is Amber Hawes, and I'm the Senior Communications and Marketing Lead at Essential Skills Ontario. So before we get started, I just want to give you a few instructions. So at the right-hand side of your screen is your GoToWebinar dashboard. There you can chat with each other in the chat pane and ask questions. If it's a technical question, I will do my best to try to assist you. And if you have any questions about the content, feel free to just type them in the chat pane, and I'll be asking Dr. Moazzami the questions throughout the webinar, as well as at the end for the Q&A session. So just give you a brief little background about Dr. Moazzami before we get started. Dr. Moazzami is a professor of economics and econometrics at Lakehead University, and he's written extensively on economic development opportunities and challenges in Northern Ontario. He's written many reports on forestry and mining industries in Ontario and Canada, and is also an expert on Aboriginal economic development, and has written extensively on Aboriginal social and economic development issues. So, without further ado, Dr. Moazzami, I will pass it over to you to get started.
Oh, thank you very much for your introduction. The main objective of the research we have undertaken has been to analyze past, present, and future demographic changes in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. We divide our presentation today into 4 parts. Part 1 will examine demographic change in the province. Our main focus is on 4 population groups: total, Francophone, Aboriginal, and immigrant populations. We also examine population trends in rural and urban regions and pay special attention to the degree of rurality, basically meaning how far these areas, rural areas, are from population centers, from urban centers. We'll define this concept more concretely later on in our presentation. In part 2, we also look at the demographics and socio-economic trends in rural and urban areas. We look at earnings differential and investigate factors explaining the existing earning gap between rural and urban regions. To do that, we'll construct a human capital index for rural and urban areas. This index basically incorporates productivity measures, how productive workers are based on their level of education and know-how and abilities in the workforce. We'll find that basically a significant part of the earnings gap between rural and urban regions is explained by differences in the human capital composition of their employed workforce. In part 3 of the presentation today, we'll make projections of future rural and urban population based on the assumption that the past trend will continue into the future. Using the demographic forecasting model that I've developed, we not only estimate future rural and urban population, but also estimate age profiles of those who out-migrate, who move out of rural areas into urban areas and other provinces. We also check to see where those folks are going, where have they gone. We look at the destination distribution of those who have basically out-migrated from the province. And the last but not the least, we provide a summary and a statement of conclusion. Newfoundland and Labrador is unique. It is the most remote and isolated province in Canada, with a population density of 1.4 persons per square kilometer. It has the lowest density among all provinces. It has more than 560 communities. Majority of them, about 73% of them, have less than 500 inhabitants. And according to the 2011 National Household Survey, about 41% of the population, provincial population, lives in rural areas. Let's look at the population trends. Population trends is interesting. From 1951 to 2000 to 1981, population has been growing at about 2% per year. From 1981 to 1991, the growth rate declined to 1.5% per year. During the 90s, because of the declining economic situation because of a deterioration of the economic situation, collapse of the cod fishery, population declined significantly from 1991 to 2001, about 1%, 1.2% per year. And then again declined to 2006 due to major energy and resource development. During this period, population started increasing. Recent data from the Statistics Agency, from the Provinces Statistics Agency, which by the way have produced excellent information, shows that population increased from here to 2013 to 528,000, but then declined to about 527,000 in 2014. Population growth has not been uniform, basically, during the past 30, 40 years. In the 50s, population growth was about 2.67%. In the 60s, 1.59%. In the 70s, it declined to 0.8%. It reached a historical low of -1% during the 90s, of course, because of the economic condition, because of the cod fishery problem. It declined slightly during the early 2000s, but again rose because of the improved economic conditions in the province. Let's look at some general information about what constitutes, what affects population change in any province, in any region. The first item is the natural population change, defined as the number of births minus number of deaths. So that's a natural population change. If that's positive, then the population is growing. If that's negative, then population is declining, based on that one factor alone. Let's look at the birth. The number of babies born here in 1980 were about 10,325. It declined steadily to 4,455 in 2013-14. So it declined from 10,000 here to 4,000 in just last year. Decline of more than 50%. Part of it is due to aging, part of it is due to out-migration of women in childbearing ages. The second factor, death. The number of deaths here in 1980 was about 3,232. It rose slightly over time to 4,855. This is primarily due to aging process. We know that our life expectancy has increased, but the rapid aging process has increased the number of deaths. So we see that in 2013-14, these are the number of births, this is the number of deaths. So we have negative natural population change. In fact, we hit the negative population change in 2005-06. That was the only Canadian province to record a negative natural population change in that year. So that's the natural increase. So the natural population change is not helping us, is not giving rise to population increase, primarily due to very low fertility rate, which we'll talk about later on in the report. The second factor is immigration minus emigration, those people who come from other countries and those who leave. What has happened there? These are the two lines that are overlapping each other, basically going up a little bit. The green line is the immigrants, going up a little bit in 2013-14. During 1980-2013, an average of 523 immigrants came to the province, while an average of about 282 left the province. This suggests an immigrant retention rate of about 46%, which is a bit higher than what Statistics Canada has reported, 36%. I assume that their data is probably old, or they don't cover the same period as we are covering. So the retention rate, 46%, is probably one of the lowest or the lowest among all provinces in Canada. The third and very important factor is the interprovincial migration, those who come in and those who leave. We see that has always been negative. So we have always been experiencing out-migration, net out-migration. Was positive, 82, 83, slightly positive. This is a zero line. This is why the very zero line. And we also experienced net inflow during the 2008-9 because of the improved economic conditions. But again, has turned negative in 2013-14, 2,200 people left the province. We see that here the majority, the maximum out-migration, net out-migration happened during the 90s, when the economic condition deteriorated significantly in the province. So what's the implication of these three factors? Low birth minus death, low immigration, provincial, interprovincial out-migration. It basically has resulted in the province's share of the Canadian population to decline from 2.6% in 1951 to 1.7% in 2001 and 1.5% in 2011. The above trend is partly due to the unfavorable economic conditions as well as changing fertility rate in the province. Let's look at the fertility rate. Fertility rate, this is the red one is Canada, the blue one is Newfoundland and Labrador. Let me define a general concept of general replacement rate. General replacement rate of 2.1 is generally argued that 2.1 children per woman is needed to sustain population levels. We observe here that the total fertility rate, which we define as the average number of children that a woman will have over the course of her life, has been significantly below the generational replacement rate of 2.1, which is up here. In Newfoundland and Labrador, this is the historical low was reached in 2001 after the period of 90s. It's amazing how economics affects all aspects of our lives, including fertility rate. A declining economic condition, the fertility rate has declined to its lowest level, historical low, and then increased during the recovery, during the energy boom, and then in 2011 stands at 1.45 children per woman, which is significantly less than 2.1 necessary to sustain population levels, and is also below the Canadian average, below the national average. The difference between Canada and Newfoundland is that Canada receives significant in-migration. We have not been able to attract or retain migrants, immigrants. So that's the major difference between the two, the Canada, the national level, and the provincial level. What has been the result of this low fertility rate and out-migration of youth? The result has been significant aging of the population. Significant aging from 1951, the share of individuals under the age of 20, the share of individuals under the age of 20 was about 50% of the population. Pretty nice, pretty young. Has declined to about 20% in 2011. At the same time, during the same period, the share of seniors has increased from 6.4%, about 6% in the early 50s, to about 15-16% in 2011. This has significant budgetary implication for the province. Government revenues will go down because we have fewer people working or in the working age population. At the same time, a rising age of the population gives rise to significant demand for for example, healthcare services. A study I did for Northwestern Ontario shows that seniors' demand for healthcare is about 3 times the average of the overall population. And I estimated that the demand for healthcare services in 20-year time is going to be at least 50% more than what we have now. So that basically means that the province's expenditure column is going to explode, at least on this one item, and the revenue, expected revenue, is going to decline from taxes, which is not a very good prospect, especially given the fact that the oil prices have come down significantly. Aging of the population is also reflected in the fact that the median age of the residents have gone up significantly. Median age is the age that separates the higher half of the population from the lower half. So basically 50% of the population are older than the median age and 50% are younger than the median age. So we see that in 1951, the median age in the province was less than Canada. But then this has been reversed. In 2011, the median age in Newfoundland is 44 years versus 40 years for Canada. Significant change, primarily because we are all aging. All provinces are experiencing the same phenomenon. The difference is the degree. The difference is the degree, and the difference is how many people are in the working age population, working age segment. What is happening to the labor force, the supply of the workers, and the quality in terms of productivity, as we are going to see shortly. Another aspect of demographic change relates to the cultural and linguistic diversity of the population. The share of the Francophone population, we see here, increased by about 1.6%. The share of the immigrants increased slightly. Aboriginal population, their share has increased very significantly. The unreserved population has doubled their share. The off-reserve population has almost doubled. There are many factors explaining the significant increase in the number of Aboriginal population. One is higher fertility rate. One is that they are much younger than the general population. One is that they are participating at a larger numbers in the census. So there are different factors explaining their rising number of Aboriginal population. We are going to look at that later on in this presentation. Part 2 of the report, we basically look at the demographic change in rural and urban regions in the province. Before we do so, let's define what we mean by rural, what we mean by urban. There has been an age-old debate regarding whether rural is a geographical concept, or a social representation, or a culture and a way of life. What we have done in this study, we are focusing on the geographical definition, classification of rural regions. There are at least 6 different definitions of rural areas, each emphasizing different criteria, such as population size, population density, labor market context, and of course using different definitions will give rise to different numbers of people in rural and urban regions. Statistics Canada suggests that as a starting point we should use rural and a small town definition. That is the population not living in census metropolitan areas or census agglomerations. Census metropolitan areas and census agglomerations are those with 10,000 and more population. So basically, Statistics Canada's definition of rural suggests that rural areas are those that have less than 10,000 population. It's a good starting point. We have also checked the validity of our results using different definitions, like using rural as places with less than 1,000 population to see whether our results are robust, whether the results change or not. The results have been very robust, the overall results have not changed at all. Now that we have defined, I'm going to define rural and urban further when we go on. But let's just take a look at this. The total population during 2001-2011 has increased marginally, 0.6% over 10 years, 0.6% over 10 years. But urban population has increased by 12.2% during the same 10 years, 1.2% per year. Rural population has declined by 8.4%. The decline in the rural population is important. It has not only declined in absolute term, but has also declined in relative term. The share of the population living in the small and rural and small towns declined from 56% in 2001 to 51% in 2011. Later on in the presentation, we'll check how much of this population decline is due to low fertility and aging of the population, and how much of it is due to outmigration of the population. This is an interesting slide and educational. What is this symbol? Symbol MIZ means Metropolitan Influence Zone. Metropolitan Influence Zone is the statistical area classification used by Statistics Canada. Let's assume urban areas are here. On the left-hand side of my screen, under strong mixed areas, rural areas, are those areas from which more than 30% of their workforce, travel to rural urban areas for work and come back. Moderate metropolitan influence zones are areas, rural areas, from which 5 to 30% of the population of the workforce travels to urban areas to work and come back. Weak metropolitan influence zones are places where less than 5% of the workforce travels to urban areas to work and then come back. And NOMIs, as is clear by its name, are areas where nobody from here travels to work in urban centers, in population centers. In fact, mobile workers have become a new normal. More and more people are choosing to travel long distances. From here, northwestern Ontario, people travel to Alberta to work, 2 weeks work and 1 week back home. So people are choosing to travel long distances to work rather than changing their place of residence. This is a new phenomenon. It's very interesting. We are not addressing it completely in this report, but we'll probably look at it in a future report. So now let's look at this. When we look at, now that we have classified rural areas into, consider it distance from urban centers to different rural areas, different degree of rurality. This is very rural, remote, this is almost remote, this is less remote, and this is close to urban centers. Population in all these areas has declined. In the strong mixed area, population has declined by about 1.8%. In moderate mixed areas, population has declined by about 9.2%. In weak mixed areas, population has declined by 1.6%. And in no mixed areas, significant, population has declined by about 53%. So these areas, the remote areas, are the areas hardest hit by outmigration and declining population. Outmigration of youth has resulted in the significant aging of rural population. we see that the population under 20 has declined by about 5%. This is 5%. Population, these are the prime working age group. The prime working age group, the population has declined by about 7.1%. 50 to 64 has increased by 7.5%. And 65 and over, seniors, has increased by 4.9, about 5%. As I mentioned, this aging population, aging rural population, which is much more pronounced than the urban population, has significant impact on healthcare demands. So basically, and lowering and declining working age, prime working age groups, basically means less taxes, lower income for the government. So it's basically the income is declining, the expenditures are increasing, economic factors seriously impact our economy, our lives, our social lives, services that we have access to, and the like. Let's check to see how sensitive our classifications are to the definition of rural. Here, rural is defined as places with less than 1,000 population. Urban is defined as places with more than 1,000 population. By the way, this is the definition used by Statistics Canada in most publications. I have a significant problem with this definition because using this definition can give rise to defining some of the native reserves, aboriginal reserves, northern reserves as urban centers. For instance, Atawapiskat Indian Reserve in James Bay area has about 1,100 population, is less than a square kilometer, so the population density is high and the population is greater than 1,000. So can you classify that as urban? That's a different issue. So let's look at this. Here we basically see that the total population is total population. It follows the same pattern as we saw before. The urban population, the same pattern. Basically, it basically goes up during the early 90s. Interesting that the 91 to 96 urban population increases while rural decreasing, meaning or suggesting that maybe the out-migration that was happening here, people were first going to urban regions to see whether they can find employment or not. And basically has stayed constant and then has increased during the 2006-2011 as the economic conditions improved. Rural population follows the same routine, same trend as we saw before. Basically has been steady, constant, and then starting declining from 1991 onward. So the changing of a definition hasn't changed the overall population trends in rural and urban region. Look at this one, the classification of rural into a strong, moderate, weak, and no metropolitan influence zone. When we compare this with the previous slide I showed you, the distribution of the population is very close to the distribution of rural and small town population. So basically, again, majority live in moderate, mid areas, some in weak, so mostly on the upper tail of the distribution, the rural population, upper tail of the distribution, and some in the lower tail of the distribution. Let's look at the other population groups. Francophone population. Francophone population, 42% of them, 43% of them live in urban areas. The rest, or 58%, live in rural areas. Majority are in moderate and weak mid areas. Very few are in remote areas. The distribution basically shows that they are underrepresented in urban regions and overrepresented in rural regions. They are older. They are also older than the general population. Their average age in 2011 compared to the provincial average of 41.2 years. Aboriginal population. 25% live in urban areas, the rest live in rural areas, majority in weak metropolitan influence zone, and some in many are in no-means, very remote areas. It's nicer to look at the distribution of unreserved, off-reserve Aboriginal population. The unreserved Aboriginal population, almost all of them live in very remote rural areas, either very weak or absolutely remote areas. The off-reserve population, 28% of them lives in urban areas, the rest in rural areas, majority in the weak mixed areas. Just some numbers on Aboriginal population. It was about 19,000 in 2001, increased to about 36,000 in 2011. This is a growth rate of about 91%. We have discussed various factors explaining the significant rise of the Aboriginal population. As I mentioned, some relate to higher fertility rate, which is higher than the generational replacement rate of 2.1. Some relate to the fact that they are much younger, and some relate to the fact that they are participating in huge numbers in the census. Let's look at some socio-economic indicators. Socio-economic indicators during 2001-2011, we see that participation rate has increased. Of course, improved economic conditions create expectation of finding employment, and then more people participate in the labor force. This shows the same picture. The unemployment rate has declined from 2001 to 2011 significantly, 10%, more than 10%, about 10%. So unemployment rate has declined, participation rate has increased, but the striking feature of this graph is that unemployment rate in urban areas in 2011 increases as the degree of rurality increases. 30% of remote areas are unemployed, 25% are unemployed in the weak mixed areas, 23% in the moderate metropolitan areas. So unemployment rate, as it was in 2011, 2001, increases with the degree of rurality. In fact, the unemployment rate here is about 2.2 times the unemployment rate in urban areas. That's alarming. That's alarming. In fact, we are going to see that there are other problems associated with this picture. Dependency rate on government transfers. Unbelievable how closely this tracks the unemployment rate. So the dependency rate on government transfers is basically 12% in urban and about 25-26% in rural areas. Closely tracks, mirrors the unemployment rate. So later on, when we talk about options, one option, if you have high unemployment rate or high number of unemployable people, then we have to make a decision. Do we want to basically pay them more transfer payments, make them more dependent, or invest in human capital, which basically makes them employable? So that's one of the decisions that we will face as we go on into the future. Education, major factor. As we see here, the level of education declines, 15 to 64, declines as we move into rural areas. 30% of rural population do not have high school diploma. Another 20-30% have just high school. So basically the total sum is about 58% do not have post-secondary education. This is important because various government studies show that in 15 years' time, about 80% of jobs require some level of post-secondary education. So we do have a serious problem. The jobs of the future the jobs that are going to come in the future require post-secondary education. In fact, Canada post-secondary level of education is almost, Ontario and Canada mirror this picture. They have about 70% of the workforce. Majority have this level of education, post-secondary education. So in 10-15 years time, 80% of the jobs require post-secondary education. In rural areas, education is low. Labor force with less education cannot be employed, are going to be unemployed, they're going to be receiving transfer payments. So what will happen is what this study's title shows, that we are going to end up with people without jobs and jobs without people. Same picture, sort of. The percentage of people with employment income, 81-82% in urban areas, and then it declines to about 70% in rural areas. 70.3% on average in rural areas are employed. Again, this mirrors very closely the unemployment rate. Those unemployed do not have any, these are any employment income, not full-time. Just even if you work a few weeks, then you have employment income. So 30%, about 30% have not done any, have not had any employment income during 2011. Low-income cutoffs. What are low-income cutoffs? There are income thresholds below which a family spends a larger share of its income on the necessities of food, shelter, clothing than the average family. Basically, those categorized in low income spend more than 20% than the average family on these necessities of life. Statistics Canada calculates low-income cutoffs for different provinces, for different regions. For instance, for this province, Newfoundland and Labrador, rural areas, a family of size 3, the low-income cutoff is about $17,000. For urban areas, 30,000 to 100,000 population, family of 3, 21,000. So basically, if you assume all families of size are 3, then there are 6-7% of the households in urban areas have less than 21,000 income. About more than 10% of households in rural areas have less than $17,000 income. Average income. Average income by region. We see that average income declines as we go into the rural areas. So basically the difference between the earnings of people in urban and remote regions is about 30%. 30%, 32%, these people are earning about 72% of the income of these people. And the average full-time income is also different. In urban areas are 52,000, in moderate means 44, 48, 47. The question is what explains this earnings gap between rural and urban regions? What factors really are responsible for this earning gap? Is it distance from urban centers? Some say yes. Is it the population size? Economists of agglomeration suggest, that's a definition they use, to suggest that bigger centers, because of the proximity of firms and people, are more productive and therefore they have higher earnings. So the idea is that economists of agglomeration says that people in larger centers earn higher income because of the proximity, high productivity, and accessibility of other expertise. Another explanation is that, no, it's not the geography, it's the human capital. If their earnings are directly related to the human capital composition of the workforce in different areas. Also, the earning differential can be due to occupational and industrial composition of the workforce. Let me show you some. These are charts I did for a companion study to this study. These are interesting looking charts. These basically show you the age earning profile of residents of Newfoundland and Labrador. It basically shows how much the age, it shows the earning profile of people with different levels of education. These are men with different level of education. Less than high school, this is what they earn over their lifetime, working lifetime. High school, the red one, men, high school diploma, this is their lifelong earning profile. Trade people, college people, and of course university people. So this is a good chart to show to the kids to let them know what income they are going to be earning if they are not doing well at the school. Women, the same sort of picture, except that these three lines are closer to each other because of the occupations that are open to women with lower level of education, pay less, service occupations, pay less than those that men face in the labor market. But of course, higher education, university education, your earning profiles improves significantly. Some of the earning differences between rural and urban regions are related to the occupational and industrial structure of the workforce. Nomads areas, more people are into primary occupations. In this area, more people are into mining and primary and changes. So this does have an influence over the earnings of different people in different regions. What about human capital? We estimated this human capital, which is quite a technical procedure. This incorporates productivity levels, what people with different levels of education being paid in the market. So market determines the value of the labor, the value of the work different people perform, and those payments have been used to estimate this human capital index. We see that human capital index declines as we go from urban to very remote areas. Question: is it the geography that explains the variation of income, or is it the human capital? Let's look at the geography. We have classified different regions in the province into different population sizes. We look at the earnings, and I've calculated the average earnings. Average earnings 4,200, 42,000, and then in the smaller regions like here, average earnings are a bit higher. In here, average earnings are lower. So is it really geography? Yes, there is a positive association with geography. The smaller sizes have lower earnings. But is this correlation perfect? The correlation is not perfect. In fact, if you calculate a correlation, a simple correlation coefficient between the earnings and population size, you get a number like 0.79, which is positive and significant, but not perfect. What about the human capital? We have also calculated human capital for different regions with different levels of population. And we have found basically that if you compare this with the previous graph, which I cannot do both on the same slide, if you compare this with the previous graph, you see that human capital index follows or mirrors very closely the average earnings. In other words, if I calculate the correlation, simple correlation coefficient between the human capital and the earnings in different regions, I get a coefficient of about 0.93%, which is very high, almost close to 1, which is the maximum number a correlation coefficient can take. Let me show you some. Am I going too slowly? Maybe. As usual in classrooms, I always run out of time. So let's just look at this graph, which is interesting. It's an interesting slide. This says that 1%, let me go a bit faster, 1% increase in the employment in a region resulting 3.2% increase in average earnings. These are based on regression analysis. 1% increase in human capital index results in 0.8% increase in earnings. Regions concentrated in primary processing and agriculture have lower average earnings. Mining, 1% increase in the share of the workers working in the mining industry increases earnings, average earnings by 1%. Same for manufacturing. Presence of Aboriginal population, higher share of Aboriginal population in the region does not affect necessarily the average earnings. This is an interesting, this is an interesting slide which we are going to miss due to my mistake. Let's look at the geography, how geography explains the earning differential. The benchmark, let's just say the benchmark is here, is the urban center. The urban centers are the benchmark. So this says that those areas closer to urban centers, the strong means rural areas, have 17% lower income than urban areas. Those living in moderate means areas have 36% lower average earnings. Those living in weak means areas have 38% lower average earnings. When we control for all other variables, control for occupational and industrial classification, control for other factors, age, this result comes up. So these are pretty accurate. Weak areas, 38% less than urban areas. No means very rural, very remote areas, 35%. So geography seems to be very important. What happens when I introduce human capital to this picture? When I include human capital, the effect of geography goes back down to zero. So 100% of the earning differences between this area and urban is explained by human capital. No percentage explained by geography. Here, it declines from here to here, declines by about 87%. So only 13% is due to geography, 87% is due to human capital. Here it declines by about 75%. So only 25% is due to geography, 75% is due to human capital composition of their workforce. And here again, 100% is explained by the human capital. Not geography doesn't play any role. The population forecasts. I may have to go faster. The fertility rate, total fertility rate in Newfoundland and Labrador is 0.1.4. Total fertility rate is 1.35 in urban areas and 1.5 in rural areas. So they're significantly lower than the generational replacement rate, but rural areas have higher fertility rate than urban areas, and the blue one is the average of the two. If we use our population forecasting model to forecast the urban areas population, we see that the urban area population increases from 2011 to 2025. It's not a very long period of time, so basically the forecasting period is relatively short, so the results can be relatively accurate. 2001, 2011, 2025, the population is expected to increase by 8.7%. But the growth rate of the population, urban population, is expected to decline. I've calculated them, they're all here. It's expected to decline primarily due to the aging of the population. That's a major factor determining the population growth in this period. And what has been the factor responsible for a growing population of urban regions in Newfoundland and Labrador, given the fact that population has been declining for most of the period? The reason is here. The reason is that they have been receiving significant in-migration of people from rural areas and other provinces. So this is basically, and see that in-migration is basically primarily for younger people, younger folks who have been migrating from rural areas primarily to urban regions, and they also bringing their kids and youngsters with them. Population forecasting for rural areas, basically the rural area population is expected to decline by about 19% during the same forecasting period compared to 8.7% rise in the population of urban regions. Something we have, okay, so and the rate of decline is expected to increase significantly from now to 2025. What happens if you assume that there is no net migration from rural areas? Nobody comes in, nobody goes out. What happens to the population demographics then? You see that population still declines, 4% decline during this period, very slight. This is primarily due to aging. So the 4% decline is primarily due to aging, and we just saw that the population is expected to decline by 19%. 4% of it is due to aging, natural demographic process. So 15% of it is due to outmigration of youth from rural areas. And this is the outmigration picture. So we see that lots of younger people are moving out of the rural areas. Lots of younger people, all in working age. And then, of course, they take their youngsters with them. So that's what affects the fertility. That's what affects the population change in the province. Where do they go? In the 2001, many went to Ontario. Lots of people, 95, some 2001, but Ontario has been sending people to us. Basically, we have been receiving people from Ontario. They're coming back home. What about Alberta? Alberta, no, this picture is different. They have always been going from here, net out migration to Alberta. The only year that we did have some in-migration from Alberta was in 2009 because of the improved economic conditions. This just shows the net interprovincial migration. This is a zero line, only positive during the 2009 year. The rest have been negative, and the worrying sum is that it's again negative in 2013. About 1,800 net moved out of the province. Concluding remarks. What do we do? Aging of the population. We saw that has been happening in rural areas, more pronounced in rural areas. Effects on the labor force. Number of working age people will decline. At the same time, we saw that a very high percentage of them have no post-secondary education. The evidence that I showed you suggests that more than 80% of future jobs require some sort of post-secondary education. Evidence also suggests that rural and urban areas are experiencing a high unemployment rate along with growing demand for qualified labor. This is a skill mismatch between labor supply and demand. Given the existing condition, it's going to get worse. The human capital content is low, population labor force is declining, and the jobs that are opening up require higher skills. Lack of human labor force, lots of surveys show that basically that is a major problem. This is not just your problem. In Northern Ontario, lots of surveys, I did a survey of multinational and multi-locational firms in Northern Ontario, and they all had the same problem. They all face significant shortage of skilled labor. Sort of like the same problems in northern rural communities. Human capital is the main determinant of urban-rural earning gap. One approach to reducing the existing earning gap is to basically, as well as preparing for the jobs of the future, is by investing, increasing productivity by investing in education. Let me show you the last two graphs, or three graphs, if you may. If you get a high school diploma, what would happen to you? Good things will happen to you. The probability of working full-time increases by 5 and 8%, men and women. Probability of number of weeks worked increases by 23%, 11%, if you get a high school diploma. Your dependency rate on government transfers declines by 19%. Your probability of falling below poverty line declines by 13 and 9%. Probability of unemployment declines by 7%. Your participation rate, the likelihood of participating in the labor force, increases by 18-24%, and your earnings will go up by 30, 27, 30%. What about how much more do I get if I get a high level of education? This is, the benchmark is those without a high school diploma. If you get a high school diploma, men and women, your earnings will go up about 40 to 30% above what those folks without a high school diploma have. If you get a trade certificate, your earnings go up by this much. If you get a college certificate, your earnings almost double, more than double. If you get a university certificate, your earnings go up significantly, especially for women. If you're married and men, you have to work harder, you probably work longer, that's why you earn more. And if you're married and a woman, your family life probably interferes with your work, so you earn a bit less. Last graph. What happens if we look at investment, education as an investment? I'm spending my time that I could have worked at McDonald's and earned $10 an hour. That's what I tell my kids. If you want to work at McDonald's, that's what you're going to earn for the rest of your life. Or not earning that $10 an hour, going to college, going to university, going to high school, and working. So that's, I'm investing my time. I also have to pay for some of the college and university. So if I make those investments, years, my time, and money, what do I get in return? These are the rates of returns. The rates of returns are significantly higher than the normal returns we are observing these days, which are basically close to zero. We have done this for Aboriginal, Francophone immigrants, more or less the same pictures. I guess that's the end of, so we made it.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Dr. Moazzami, for that. So we are pretty much almost at the end of the webinar. I don't have any questions right now. I'll give people another minute again. If anyone has any questions, just type them into the chat pane. But it doesn't seem like we do have any questions. So what I will do is, this webinar is being recorded right now, so unless technology fails us, I will be sending out a link to where you can find the webinar as well. Dr. Moazzami, if you're okay with it, I will also email people your email address in case they have questions that they'd like to follow up with you on. Is that okay?
Perfectly, no problem, no problem.
Oh. Perfect. So again, there's no questions right now, so I'll be sending everyone Dr. Moazzami's email address if you'd like to follow up with him for anything. And other than that, thank you very much, Dr. Moazzami, and we will we'll see you at the next webinar.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.